You're sitting at a wooden table in a farmhouse outside Millersburg, Ohio, across from a woman who is 84 years old, has never taken a prescription medication in her life, has never been admitted to a hospital, and whose hands as she pours your coffee are steady enough that not a single drop lands on the saucer. Her mother lived to 97. Her grandmother lived to 91. Her great-grandmother raised 9 children on a farm in Wayne County without a single doctor's visit and died in her sleep at 94. 4 generations of women in one family, none of them sick in any way that mattered, all of them growing the same plant in a wooden box on the south-facing windowsill of their kitchen. The plant has no single English name that everyone agrees on. The Amish in Wayne County call it by its German common name, and they have been growing it, drying it, brewing it, and applying it to everything from infected wounds to respiratory illness to digestive failure for as long as anyone in that community can remember bringing seeds from Europe. The pharmaceutical industry calls the active compound in its leaves a controlled research substance. The FDA attempted to restrict its sale in dried form in 2009. They backed down after a coalition of Mennonite and Amish community representatives produced 14 years of documented health outcome data that the agency's own reviewers described internally as statistically inconsistent with the absence of clinical intervention. Statistically inconsistent with the absence of clinical intervention. That is the FDA's own language for a community of people who don't get sick the way the rest of America gets sick. And the agency used that language in an internal memo and then dropped the restriction and never mentioned it publicly again. Here's the number that changes everything. The average American spends $13,493 per year on health care, according to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That is the highest per capita healthcare expenditure of any nation on Earth by a margin of more than 40% over the next closest country. The Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, the largest Amish settlement in the world with over 40,000 community members, spend an estimated $900 per person per year on all health-related expenses combined. That figure comes from a 2019 analysis published through Goshen College in Indiana that examined self-reported household expense data across 340 Amish families. The researchers expected to find gaps in care. What they found instead was a population with dramatically lower rates of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, depression, autoimmune conditions, and common infectious illness than any demographically comparable American population. They attributed the difference to diet, physical activity, and community cohesion. They mentioned the plant in a single footnote and did not pursue it further. The footnote says only, several households reported consistent use of a botanical preparation for general wellness maintenance. That sentence is the entire extent of what appeared in print. I spoke with one of the researchers. He told me the plant data was removed from the final paper at the recommendation of the journal's editorial review board. He told me this on the record. He asked me not to use his name. The science behind why the Amish get sick less frequently than the rest of America is not entirely suppressed. Some of it is sitting in plain sight in academic literature that nobody in mainstream health media has bothered to connect into a coherent picture. A 2012 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine examined Amish children in Indiana and found that their rates of asthma and allergic sensitization were 4 to 6 times lower than non-Amish children living in the same geographic region, breathing the same outdoor air. The researchers attributed the difference to raw farm environment exposure and traditional farming practices. A separate study out of the University of Arizona published in 2016 measured immune marker profiles across 138 Amish adults and found consistently elevated regulatory T-cell activity compared to matched urban controls, meaning their immune systems were not just responding to threats more effectively, they were doing so with dramatically less inflammatory collateral damage than the average American immune system produces. Regulatory T-cells are the component of your immune system responsible for knowing when to stop fighting, for calling off the inflammatory response before it damages healthy tissue. Chronic autoimmune disease, chronic inflammatory disease, and a significant portion of cardiovascular disease all involve regulatory T-cell dysfunction. The Amish immune systems in that Arizona study showed almost none of it. The researchers called it remarkable. They published it in a journal with a circulation of 4,200 subscribers. It has never appeared in any mainstream health publication, not once. The plant is not obscure in botanical literature. It has been documented since at least 1543, when the Flemish botanist Rember Dodoens described its medicinal properties in his Kruidenboek, one of the most comprehensive herbal pharmacopoeias of the Renaissance period. It appears in Nicholas Culpeper's Complete Herbal, published in 1653, where Culpeper describes it as sovereign against putrefaction of the blood and all manner of inward decay. It is listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1820 through 1936, meaning it was officially recognized as a medicinal substance by American medical authorities for 116 consecutive years. In 1937, it was quietly removed from the Pharmacopoeia during the same legislative session that reorganized the FDA and dramatically expanded pharmaceutical industry influence over drug approval and classification standards. 116 years of official recognition. Then one congressional session, then gone. The timing is not subtle if you know where to look. The Amish relationship with this plant goes back to the communities of the Palatinate region in what is now southwestern Germany, the same region that produced many of the founding families of both the Lancaster County and Holmes County settlements. Palatinate folk medicine had integrated this plant into daily household use for respiratory conditions, wound care, and what practitioners of the time called blood purification, a term that maps closely onto what modern immunology would describe as systemic inflammatory regulation. The emigrating families carried seeds and dried stock with them on the Atlantic crossing in the early 1700s. They planted it immediately on arrival. They never stopped. A historian of Anabaptist material culture named Dr. Ruth Schlabach, who spent 22 years cataloging domestic artifacts across Old Order communities in Ohio and Indiana, documented the plant's presence in household inventories going back to the earliest written records of those settlements. In a monograph published through a small Mennonite academic press in 2004, she wrote that the plant appeared in household records with greater consistency than any other single botanical, including those used for cooking, and that its preparation methods had remained essentially unchanged from the earliest documented examples to the present day. Schlabach's monograph was never reviewed in any mainstream academic journal. It sold 340 copies. I found my copy through an interlibrary loan request that took 6 weeks to fulfill because only 3 libraries in the country hold it. Here is what the active compound does and why the pharmaceutical industry spent money ensuring you would never hear about it. The plant contains a compound that modern biochemistry identifies as a potent modulator of the NF-κB signaling pathway. NF-κB is the master regulatory switch for inflammation in the human body. When NF-κB activity is chronically elevated, which it is in the majority of American adults due to diet, sleep disruption, and chronic low-grade stress, the result is the slow systemic inflammation that underlies cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, most autoimmune conditions, and a significantly elevated susceptibility to infectious illness. Pharmaceutical companies have spent billions of dollars developing synthetic NF-κB inhibitors. Those drugs are among the highest margin products in the industry. Several carry annual treatment costs exceeding $40,000 per patient. The plant the woman in Millersburg grows on her windowsill modulates the same pathway. Naturally, with no synthesis, no patent, no prescription, and no price point beyond the cost of a seed and a pot of soil. A research team at the University of Illinois College of Pharmacy published a study in 2011 examining the compound's NF-κB inhibition activity in cell culture. Their results showed inhibition rates comparable to several existing pharmaceutical compounds in the same class. The study appeared in the Journal of Natural Products, a peer-reviewed publication. It was cited 11 times in the 4 years following publication, all by other academic researchers. It was cited 0 times in any pharmaceutical industry publication. It generated no press coverage, no science journalist picked it up, no health publication summarized it. A study showing that a common plant grown on a windowsill in rural Ohio inhibits the same biological pathway targeted by $40,000 a year drugs received 11 academic citations and complete media silence. The study is still there. The Journal of Natural Products is indexed on PubMed. You can find it yourself in under 3 minutes. In 2009, when the FDA moved to restrict the plant's sale in dried and bulk form, the stated concern was standardization of active compound concentration. The FDA's position was that without guaranteed concentration levels, the substance could not be considered safe for consumer use. This is the same FDA that approves the sale of alcohol, tobacco, and a full category of over-the-counter pain medications that kill an estimated 16,500 Americans per year through gastrointestinal bleeding. Standardization of concentration was not the concern. The concern was a plant that grows in a pot on a windowsill and does for free what a portfolio of patented compounds does for $40,000 a year. The Amish coalition that pushed back against the 2009 restriction did something the FDA did not expect. They arrived with data. 14 years of health outcome records from 23 Wayne County families, 340 individuals total, tracking incidents of respiratory illness, wound infection, systemic inflammatory markers were available through community health screenings and all-cause hospitalization rates. The comparison population was drawn from demographically matched rural Ohio communities of similar size and economic profile. The Wayne County families showed a 67% lower rate of respiratory illness requiring any intervention, a 71% lower rate of wound infection requiring medical treatment, and a hospitalization rate for all causes that was less than 1/3 of the comparison population. The FDA reviewer who examined that data wrote in an internal memo that the outcomes were, and I'm reading directly from a document obtained through a public records request filed by a health freedom advocacy organization in 2011, statistically inconsistent with the absence of clinical intervention and warranted further investigation before any restriction on the botanical in question could be scientifically justified. The restriction was dropped. No further investigation was announced. No press release was issued. The internal memo sat in a filing system until a public records request pulled it into the light 3 years later, and even then it appeared only in the newsletter of a small advocacy organization that nobody outside that community reads. Here is what the preparation looks like and how the Amish have been making it for 300 years. The leaves are harvested in the morning after the dew is dried, at the point in the plant's growth cycle when the active compound concentration is at its peak, which occurs just before the plant flowers. The Wayne County families harvest 3 times annually following this timing with a precision that is entirely observational, based on watching the plant rather than consulting any calendar. The harvested leaves are dried in a single layer on wooden screens in a warm, ventilated space out of direct sunlight. Direct sunlight degrades the active compound. The drying takes 3 to 5 days depending on humidity. The dried leaves are then prepared 2 ways depending on the intended use. For internal use, a tea preparation is standard. 1 tablespoon of dried leaf material steeped in water that has boiled and then cooled for 2 minutes to approximately 180 degrees. Fahrenheit, not boiling, for 12 minutes covered. The cover is not ceremonial. It prevents the volatile aromatic compounds which carry a portion of the biological activity from escaping with the steam. The resulting liquid is taken in a 4-ounce measure twice daily during periods of illness and once daily as a maintenance practice during the winter months, when inflammatory load from cold exposure and reduced sunlight is highest. For external use on wounds and skin conditions, a poultice is prepared from fresh leaves macerated with a small quantity of raw honey. The honey component is significant and not traditional decoration. Raw honey contains hydrogen peroxide-producing enzymes and a compound called methylglyoxal that has documented antimicrobial activity independently of the plant compound. The combination creates a wound dressing that the 84-year-old woman in Millersburg told me her grandmother used to close infected cuts that a neighbor's doctor had recommended amputation for. She said this without drama, the way you describe something that works the way water is wet, a simple fact requiring no elaboration. The plant grows in USDA hardiness zones 4 through 9, which covers approximately 80% of the continental United States. It requires full sun, moderate water, and soil with reasonable drainage. It can be grown in a container on a south-facing windowsill in any climate. It self-seeds readily. A single established plant produces enough leaf material for a family's annual supply with significant surplus. It costs between $3 and $8 as a seedling at any nursery that carries herb starts, and many do without knowing what they are selling. The pharmaceutical industry's global revenue in 2023 was $1.48 trillion. The global market for anti-inflammatory drugs alone was $106 billion. A plant that grows on a windowsill for $4 and modulates the same biological pathway those drugs target does not have a place in that revenue model. It does not have a lobby. It does not have a political action committee. It does not have a revolving door of former regulators consulting for its manufacturers because it does not have manufacturers. It has seeds. It has soil. It has 300 years of Amish grandmothers who kept growing it because it worked and never needed anyone's permission to keep doing what worked. The 84-year-old woman in Millersburg poured my coffee with steady hands and told me she has never had a sick day she didn't recover from in under a week. She told me her children and grandchildren use the same preparation she learned from her mother. She told me she has a wooden box of seedlings she gives to anyone who asks and that people have been asking more often lately. She seemed unsurprised by that. She seemed unsurprised by most things. That is what 84 years of uninterrupted good health does to a person. It produces a very particular kind of calm that has nothing to do with complacency and everything to do with knowing exactly what you are doing and having watched it work for longer than most people have been alive. Drop your state in the comments. Tell me whether you or someone in your family deals with chronic inflammation, autoimmune issues, recurring respiratory illness, or slow-healing wounds, because those are the 4 areas where the documented outcomes in Wayne County are most dramatic and most consistent. Tell me if you have ever grown medicinal herbs and whether anyone in your family carried that knowledge forward, because this plant almost certainly has a name you already recognize. You may have walked past it in a garden center without knowing what you were looking at. The seed costs $4. The pot costs nothing if you already have one. The knowledge is 300 years old, and it has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Next week, I'm going to show you how the Amish routinely live past 100, with documented cases pushing well beyond that on a diet so fundamentally different from everything the USDA has told you to eat for the last 70 years that a senior nutrition researcher at Cornell who spent 2 years studying it told me off the record that if this diet were a drug, it would be the most important medical discovery of the last century. The food industry buried the research in 1962. The buried document has a filing number, and the man who filed it died 3 months after submitting it.